Hello, everyone. Good evening. Welcome to another edition of ShareIT. ShareIT is an event which is presented to you by ThoughtWorks Italy. ThoughtWorks is a leading global technology consultancy company, and we help a lot of our clients and enterprises. We believe as a result of the work we've done with a lot of clients, we end up learning a lot of new technology and tools, and we believe in learning and sharing, because of which a lot of thought workers have gone on to write a lot of books and a lot of insight blogs, which can be found on the ThoughtWorks website. Now coming to ShareIT as an event, ShareIT was started as an Italian technology community to share experiences from ThoughtWorks Italy and ThoughtWorks all over to the world. The mission is to empower individuals and organizations with an objective of contributing our learnings to the community, because we do believe in thought leadership. How does this happen? ShareIT is a recurring event which happens once every month, which is on the last Thursday of every month. We have regular events, and we discuss everything about technology, like architecture, technology design, agile team practices, and optimizations, and anything. It could also be about diversity and inclusions. Today, before we get started with Mani's talk, quick code of conduct. Let's all be kind to each other. If there are no silly questions, any question is a valid question, so feel free to use the Q&A section or to post your questions, and we will allocate some time for answering the questions towards the end of the talk. But if there's some of them can be taken by Mani during the course of the presentation itself. Be kind and respectful to each other, and we are all here to learn from each other. Please do share your experiences or if you have any comments on the topic being presented in the chat, and we can also take up a discussion if time permits. Without any further ado, Mani, it's all yours.
All right. I'll try to share the screen.
I think we can see that.
Pallavi, me exactly. Perfect. Now you should have the control. Great.
Okay. Is the screen visible for everyone?
It is, it is.
Awesome. Cool. All right. Cool. I mean, quick intro about me. So myself, Manikandan, shortly called as Mani. So I am an application developer at ThoughtWorks. My focus is towards full stack development. So today we are going to look about the micro frontends. Quick agenda of it is how, why do we need micro frontend at first place, and what it is, and then how you actually can build, how you can actually determine all the micro frontends before getting started. And all. We'll also see a couple of options on how you can integrate or bring in the micro frontend itself into your organization. Eventually, we'll see a quick glimpse about how whether any best practices can be followed while deciding to go with the micro frontend architecture itself. Right? So quickly, thanks a lot for everyone to joining this session. So please do post your question and answers. We have a dedicated section for question and answers, but feel free to put it. I'll try to answer as much as possible. All right. Okay, so quickly getting started with it, right? So when we actually start thinking about why do we need micro frontend, why do we need such a huge change to bring into your organization, right? So it always comes down to scaling of your application, right? So when a company is very small, everything will be fine. You have a small team who actually quickly develop certain things and all, and then deploy it, and then quickly see all those things. But the challenge comes when it actually start becoming an enterprise, or it becomes an enterprise itself, right? So that is when you start seeing a lot of challenges. You will immediately think about these parameters that is mentioned over here, right? So you'll try to increase the performance by increasing the resources on all, and then you'll try to improve the time taken for the request, all those things, right? By reducing the latency. Eventually, you will also have to manage high user base and all. But enterprise not only deals with scaling of application, right? So when you are talking about scaling of application, there is also another challenge that enterprises faces these days, which is scaling application teams, right? Like we called it out, I called it out saying that when a company is small, everything is to be pretty easy, right? So when the team is small, basically the left side that we are talking about over here, you're starting with a project, there will be a small team quickly developed, and then the life is easier over there, right? When it comes to expanding your application, you increase the scope of your application, and eventually your company also starts growing, right? So that is where you try to increase number of team members, which means the vertical scaling of teams that we see on the middle part of here. So here you will try to somehow survive by bringing in some practices, guidelines and all, right? So for example, if you want to maintain a development discipline and all, you'll try to bring in a linting as part of your pipeline, something like that. So there are so many examples, right? So somehow you survive with that. But when it grows, when it marches towards becoming an enterprise.
Sorry, I need to interrupt. Can I please ask you to speak a little bit slower? You know me, I'm getting older and older. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I'll quickly recap, right? So scaling application teams, that's what we were talking about, right? So when the teams are very small, like a couple of members into the team, so you develop applications very quickly. You just quickly do some development and then test it, then deploy it, look at the feedback pretty earlier. You don't have much things to do, much things to take care. You'll be a bit fast paced. But when it comes to increasing the number of teams where your company is also eventually grows, right? So you'll try to survive by establishing some guidelines, some technical practices and all. You'll try to bring in certain aspects towards that so that your team survives, right? And then when it becomes as an enterprise, like a big company over here, that is when the challenge comes into picture, because you're talking about evolution of your application, which means a single code base and everyone has to work on the same code base and then deliver something. Right? So this is when teams start feeling the heat on the coordination part, the collaboration, all those things compared to the coding itself. Right? So when it comes to scaling, you will immediately think about bringing in some design pattern into the picture, right? So like we said, when there is a small application, you will immediately start with a front end and a back end. So front end is built with either some framework or some templating engine, and eventually in back end you will have some APIs, or it can also be built under some framework. Right? So things are very easy, but unless you want to scale it with all the teams, this monolith can be a pretty good starting point for an application. But eventually, like we saw in the earlier slide, right, the vertical scaling, where the company starts growing. So you will immediately think about, okay, I have a single service. Now the module responsibility starts growing. Let me add multiple services, the microservices, right? So this term has been there for last decade as well. So everybody started utilizing these pattern now. It's kind of becoming like a default standard for most of the organizations these days. So you split all the services over here, like you also have set of boundaries for different services over here. Right? In which ways you also achieve the diversified technologies. One service can build under Elasticsearch for some search capabilities. Eventually another service can build using some MongoDB and henceforth. Right? So you take the same problem statement in terms of front end. Right? So we always start with a simple application. There will be a backend, front end, and you eventually change the backend part with multiple services. It's like a by default decisions that we always make. But most of the time, we end up having a single code base on a single application. It's always a single application for a front end. So this is like an evolution of application in terms of front end, you can consider in that way. But what is the problem of having a UI monolith here? Like, which means coupling of components, right? So everything is one single application over here. So there will be occasions that you would have faced where UI team says they have to deploy, but the backend team already completed with their development, right? But the other way is also possible. Backend team comes saying that don't deploy the UI until the backend is ready. So there is a dependency that you actually see over here. So that creates a lot of dependencies on deployments. You cannot test for the feature that you have developed. This is one such challenge or a problem that you're trying to solve, right? So here we are talking about certain other things as well. One could be like large and uneven code base and knowledge of your code base. So it's pretty evident that these are all the challenge factors that you will start looking at, right? So when you're talking about a single application, that means you have to redeploy the entire application for any update that you make, irrespective of how it's featured or a bug fix or whatever it is. The continuous deployment is very difficult over here. Eventually, the testing of things. So you make a small change, you just, for example, you just change the behavior of a button and all, but again, you have to deploy the entire application. That means the QA has to test the whole application again and again. So you can sense the dependencies over here all the time. And eventually the performance, right? It's a big application that we are talking about. So in technical terms, that means it leads to a bigger bundle size. Eventually, it will also impact the performance. And of course, it's tough to maintain, right? It comes at a cost, basically. So if it is a huge code base, the knowledge has to be shared across the team. So if you are trying to onboard a new developer, it comes at a cost, right? It takes a lot of time to onboard a new developer itself. So that is when the micro frontend comes into picture, right? So this image that you see over here, it's a bit self-explanatory, right? So you have a service and also a front end associated with that, which forms a team altogether, right? So each team will have their own service and also handle their own UI altogether, right? So similar to microservices, where in simple, right? We can take it as a simple example, like microservices for the backend and microservices for the front end itself, right? So it's more like a design pattern to break down the monolith UI that we just saw in the earlier slide to multiple, deployable units itself. So if you notice, team build their own APIs and UIs together and take it to release without waiting for another team to build a feature for it. Right? So what a micro frontend is, it should have its repository of itself and have its own release cycle. So you achieve the independent release or independent deployments, which we will see together. But now that we know what is a micro frontend, why do we need it? You have a base idea about it, right? But how do you build a micro frontend? So how do you actually define micro frontend for your organization? There are 5 key aspects that I just jot down over here, which plays a critical role on decision making itself. Is there a question?
Okay. No, that's just me making noise. No, because somebody let us know that the chat was disabled when we started the webinar. Now it's enabled. So sorry about that. That wasn't meant to be. So feel free to use the chat. And if you want to ask any questions, feel free to use the Q&A section. Sorry, Mani, to interrupt. Please continue.
No, thank you. So yes, right. So how do you define? How do you build micro frontend? How do you identify different micro frontends over here? So we will try to cover the first 2 factors, which is slicing, which means you have to identify the separate pieces of your entire application, of your entire product, right? And eventually we will try to cover the composition of it, the orchestration of all the micro frontends that you identified earlier. And we'll try to touch base minimal information about communication, authentication, and testing as well. I'll try to give some options that might suit according to your organizational needs, right? So it always comes down to the requirement as well. You cannot blindly go for a solution, right? So moving on, the very first one, the slicing part, right? So the word slice comes into picture in a development cycle, I would say, right? It's never easy to slice anything and everything. Even in a microservice world, you always need to identify the boundary, right? So you cannot blindly go for different services for different modules. So you have to define the boundary accordingly. So in a in a front-end world in general, you'll always have this thought process, right? So for example, if you take an e-commerce website, there is a search bar, there is a filter, all those things. You might immediately think about, can I make all these components as a separate micro front-end? Of course, yes, right? It shares its own responsibility. For example, there is a search bar. You type something, and then it also has another feature of autocomplete and all. Right? It has its own usages. But now, can it be another micro front end? If you think in that way, there will be so many components because we end up having a lot of components. So that means we are talking about a lot of micro front ends again. But in other way, if you think, why not I make the entire page as a micro front end, right? So like 90% of the page can be one micro front end and remaining as another and all. It works, right? I mean, you don't have to, it doesn't go in the other way around. But if you look at it, what is the responsibility that you share? Do you achieve the independent deployment, independent releases altogether? Maybe not, right? So that is where the bounded context pattern comes into picture, right? So this is a pattern that most of the backend developers follow to determine the boundaries, right? It says it is very complex to determine the border of a domain. Right? Let's take the e-commerce example again, right? So in an e-commerce website, you sell products, right, to the customer. So everything points to the customers altogether, right? So the customer model can have their wish list, they can have their profile information, transaction, historical data, etc. Right? Does all the customer model requires the same fields or attributes? Not right. Every entity should have its own attributes within the customer. What I mean is here, the bounded context helps in creating subdomains. Basically, in the picture, the dotted line that you see represents a subdomain, which a subdomain is something that solves a particular problem, right? Also, so here the bounded context helps you to determine the entities within the subdomains. For example, let's take the sales context and support context over here, right? Sales context is nothing but it actually sells some things to the customers. But the support context, where it actually you need to get some information of a customer to help resolve the customer issues. But both these customers need to share the same attributes or fields, not right. So this is where the bounded context will help you to find the boundaries within the entity to build a model around it. Right? So let's take an example, the same e-commerce example, right? So here I use Amazon.com product details page, right? Where I just marked different subdomain, different modules over here as a separate front end, micro front end itself. Like immediately you can think about, can every component over here can be a micro front end? Maybe not, because here, if you notice, everything talks about a product basically, right? So we have this product summary, we have this product information, and there's a recommendation section, product pricing and promotion and customer reviews. Everything revolves around the product. But does everything has to be a single micro front end? Maybe not, right? Because if you take the red color that is marked over here as part of the bounded context, which represents the product context and product context alone. But if you might have this question, recommendation section also talks about products, right? But it actually recommends a list of products as well. So the focus is very different over here. So here we take the components that represents product as an entity, where you show the product details itself. So in that way, the product summary and product information can be a separate team, can be a separate micro front end as part of the bounded context, and recommendations can be another micro front end, eventually the promotion and custom reviews. If you take the question that we had, right, what about the page level as an entire micro front end? Of course, you can start with that, but again, then another question comes into picture saying that how do you want to scale it, right? So that is when you have to think about these boundaries as well. I see a question. How do we handle shared components between different micro front end, shared libraries, or is there any better way? Actually, it's a very good question, but I'll answer it a bit later because there is a dedicated slide for it. I don't want to spoil. That's all. Yeah. So I'll just move on. I'll remember about this question. Yes. Cool. So quick summary, right? So what are all the key takeaways that you have to do as part of identification of all the micro frontends? First, simply start with the exercise of identifying bounded context, right? But you will immediately see, as a developer, do I need to do all these things? It's never a developer decision at all. It always comes down to the product owners, the user UX, the BAs, the stakeholder decisions, everything comes together to determine the logical boundary of bounded context itself. This is where the core crux of domain-driven design lies, right? It revolves around the bounded context, where you share a common language, a ubiquitous language across the business stakeholders, where product owners, BAs, everyone comes into the picture and shares a common language itself, so that you build a model around that. Eventually, you will also have, like we said, right? So try to have the same team that takes care of both microservice and the corresponding front end as well, so that you achieve the independent release and independent deployment and all.
Mani, there's a question. I think you kind of started talking about various roles also. It's about how does this bounded context impact slicing stories?
Okay. I think that I can answer quickly. So, yeah. So here we are talking about the subdomains, right? The bounded context always impacts the slicing because the bounded context revolves, always determines the domain's point of view. If it is going to be a domain, the individual dependencies also determined, right? So for example, we had this example, right, on the product details page itself. You have the recommendation. So the recommendation can be very specific to a user, where you can determine through analytics and all, right? But if you try to incorporate with product details and product summary and all, you lose the scalability out of it. So if you determine the bounded context between these two, the responsibility is very different. That is why I called it as focus is very different. Maybe for the product summary and product specifications that we have, doesn't need high scalability. It's more like a read-only data, right? So all you have to do is achieve the scalability in terms of request. But for the recommendation, you have another dependency on the analytics, on the user's information, and then give the result to the user. So this is where the difference between comes from. Okay. So, move on. All right, so now we have determined the pieces, multiple pieces in terms of domain, right? We have categorized, we have determined the context for all for our application itself. Now, how do you take these multiple front ends that you determine, the separate pieces? How do you achieve the, how does it come together to form a single application? Of course, you are talking about a product, right, at the end of the day. So in this case, there are a couple of options that we have. I'll just try to explain one by one, which is not like, each and every options that we see here as part of this orchestration options, like build time, runtime. There are so many categories, right? I just wanted to express all these options to you because at the end, once you determine each and every key aspects that we just saw for building a micro frontend, you will eventually need to identify what needs that satisfies for you. So here, to begin with the build time composition, right? So this solution, maybe if you would have already start using this in your application and all. Let's quickly look at how it works, right? So here, there are so many teams. Like team 1 has something to build, and then they publish some package, and team 2 does that, team 3 does that, right? So everyone actually publish some package to the NPM repository. And if you're a front-end developer, if you're a developer, basically you would have, if you worked on a Node.js project, you would have noticed that why the NPM repository comes into picture, where you store all the packages, right? But this may be not a recommended approach because as it might be easy for the small teams, which is team 1, team 2, team 3, because they independently do something and then publishes it, but not for the integration team. No, this is what we call it as distributed monolith altogether, right? The thing is, if you look at the example on the right side, where the containers packages on talks about, right? So you can take the first three packages, assume it was developed by the team 1, team 2, team 3 itself. So here the problem is, although they develop and then test it independently, when the problem comes for the integration team to, while it actually stitches it so that you see it as a single web application, right? The downside of this composition is, the upside will be very easy to implement. There are things, or the boilerplate already supports to set up certain repositories and all. You will achieve the composition bit easier. But the downside is, what if the team wants to make a change, okay, but they want to see it as a product, the final web application. They have to rely on the containers. So you have to deploy the containers again. But what if on the same time, the team 2 also develop something, right? So that means you have to redeploy again and again. You lose the independent deployment over here, independent releases over here, right? But however, I just wanted to call it out. It might be the go-to solution for certain application. Like, for example, an hybrid application that was built using React Native or Flutter and all, where you need a single package, have a single application at the end of the day. You're going to submit some single package to the App Store and all, right? So that means it exactly, the built-in composition is something what you exactly look at it, right? So the trade-offs and drawbacks, right? Right. Similarly, there is another option, like we saw, right? Couple of options on orchestration. So runtime composition is another one, which has a couple of other options to consider as well, where the client-side composition comes from. This is one of the most preferred composition, is what I would say, that most of the organization try to achieve it, especially they want to scale it in a high level. Here also we have different teams, builds different applications, different micro frontend in our case. But unlike the built-in composition, here browser takes care of all the stitching for these things, right? So here the container team that you see here, they would need, they will actually take care of. So the container team actually acts as a parent component, for example. So here, similar to the built-in composition, right? Here the container team does not going to stop from anything. That's the big difference over here. So to iterate, right, the container application here acts as more of a parent component that combines all the other micro frontends. But the rendering is always taken care by the browser itself. So there is no blocking, or there is no dependency on deploying at all, right? So each and every team develops certain things, but it comes as a unified application at the browser end of the day. There are a couple of options that to achieve this. Either you can write your own code to have the container to stitch all these things for you, to render it as a child components for you, and browser takes care at the runtime. Or else you have the single SPA framework, which is also quite famous and all. It was also part of our ThoughtWorks tech radar. And there is one go-to library that I heard, which is from Webpack, the Module Federation Library plugin, where you can just simply config one of the micro frontend, where you can just refer the source of it. It automatically takes care of stitching and then gives you as a single web application. It's a very quick solution as well, that most of the organizations started utilizing in terms of client-side composition. So similarly, there is another option called edge-side composition. Spoiler alert, this is kind of an old option, I would say. Why? Because here also there is a different team who builds it, tests it, and then deploy it. But there is a platform team who actually takes care of the template composition as well, who takes care of the stitching of all these things. If you take the example on the right side that you see here, where there is a tag called ESI include, which refers to the shopping cart of the source. Shopping cart is nothing but one of the application, one of the micro frontend built by the team 1 itself, team 1 or team 2, team 3, whatever it is, right? But this option is more powerful because it can be cached. Why? At the end, on the browser, it doesn't render the tag ESI include. Instead, it renders the entire HTML for you. So at the end, you just see an HTML and JavaScript where the performance can easily achieve at the browser level. This can also be a very good starting point to start with the micro frontend architecture, because eventually you can start migrating to client side because everything revolves around the same HTML and JS itself. And incorporating this will be a bit easier because you don't, maybe you have a server, or you can also set up a CDN, which takes care of the template composition for you as well. So it could be a very good starting point. And then eventually, if you try to go for the client side where you achieve, where you have more control, more maintainability and all, this could be a very good starting solution. Why it is considered as old option or maybe not used, because there are no many options in terms of libraries, right? I mean, most of the time, we try to utilize some frameworks or libraries that is matured enough, which satisfies our requirements. Cool. So moving on, there is another side, so another option on the composition, which is the server side composition itself. The term server side, you would have heard a lot so far. As we started using front-end frameworks these days, Angular, React, Vue.js, and all. So there is something called server side rendering and all, right? So there is a similar pattern within the micro front-end as well, where you have the different teams again. Do something and then deploy it. You end up having the application as part of every team. But unlike the client side, where this one is a very different composition, because they might not expose any JavaScript or HTML files. Instead, they would expose some templates, right? So here there is another team that manages the routing or the layout service for you itself, right? Which is marked as dotted lines over here. For example, let's take the user e-commerce again as an example, right? So a user requests for a product details page with different components. Things will happen behind the scene over here. The layout service will intelligently construct the layout, the entire layout for us, and then use the appropriate JavaScript and HTML, and then send it to the browser. So most of the organizations try to prefer this composition, especially the organization that is end user facing, right? End user means it should always be scalable at a high level. So that means they will consider this as a go-to composition as they get better performances, because you can do a lot of optimizations within the layout service layer, like caching, handle duplication of imports before sending it to client and all, right? So there are so many options. But of course, this also has upside and also the downside as well, where the setting up of this platform team, the layout service layer is not so easy. If you think about, let's forget about micro front-end. In general front-end world, even the server-side rendering requires an additional effort to have that layer, right? So you have to set up certain things so that you achieve the server-side rendering. That is where the Next.js and similar libraries excels. So similarly, here also you have to have another extra layer, extra effort to be put up to get the layout service done. But of course, there are some options over here, like Taylor, which is under the name Project Mosaic, just gives the ability to plug and play the entire layout service for yourself. So you just need to plug it, and then it renders as a single application for you at the end of the day. So there are some options. I'll try to share all these options and then links to you. It should always better to start looking at whether it satisfies your requirement. I'll quickly pass for now. Is there any questions apart from Ashit's?
No.
Okay, great. I'll move on. Cool. So now you have identified the micro front ends, and then you have come up with an orchestration option. You have decided which option you want to go, client side, or maybe build time as well, right? According to your needs. But now we are talking about multiple micro front ends. It's not just going to be a couple of it, right? So that is when the communication comes into picture. The communication is something unavoidable in micro front end world, right? For example, one micro front end can depend on another micro front end itself for certain interactions or at a data level. So here, again, you have a couple of options that you can choose according to your requirement. Before going deep onto the storage base or event base, right? So you might think about why not use something that already exists. So if your micro frontend is built on top of React, right? So all the micro frontends utilizes the React framework as part of your frontend framework. maybe you will immediately think about why not prop-based communication. It's very straightforward. Right? You don't need to set up anything. You just send it via the props to the other components. Very easy. But again, the downside is it's very hard to achieve if two micro front ends are not using the same framework. What I mean is, if your application just started growing and you want to incorporate, you want to bring in the micro front end, maybe it's a simple solution, right? It's a simple decision to make because you would have decided that, okay, let me just use React as a single framework for the entire application. But what about the applications that are already legacy? The organization want to move from legacy into the modern framework itself. That means they would have already gone for some other framework or maybe old framework. And you try to make some new modules or some important modules where the scalability requires more. You try to bring in new frameworks over here. But again, you cannot wait for the entire micro front end architecture for your application to be ready on the very first month or two, right? So it's a long process basically. So in this case, prop-based may not be the right approach, but this is not the only problem, right? So in a React world, you would have already faced the prop drilling issues, right? When your application starts growing, when you're dealing with 20, 30 components and all, you will end up having this prop drilling issue all the time. Of course, you can solve it using the, bringing in the context or have a state management like the Redux and all to solve all these things. But at a single application, it will be a bit straightforward because that's the React pattern, like a go-to pattern that we use. But we are talking about multiple front ends over here. So again, you have to come up with a strategy. Maybe you have a global state management on that. If I'm not wrong, I think single SPA also have that option as part of the client-side composition, where you can also have a global state management for entire micro frontends itself. So similarly, there you would have thought about this. Why not I use the local storage or the session storage directly? It's very straightforward. All you have to do is just two APIs: get item, set item. Life is easier, right? But these APIs can work for both build time and runtime integration for the micro frontends. It's not a problem. But the thing is, the APIs, the storage APIs provided by the different platforms do not support the subscription pattern, right? So what I meant is, when you are actually updating your local storage, which a front end actually relies on, that micro front end that doesn't know whether the data is updated or not. It will not immediately read the new data when it is updated by other micro front ends, right? So you need an asynchronous or maybe a pub/sub model that has to be built around it. This technique, however, will be more useful when two micro front ends are in two different screens, because as the reader, you can fetch the updated data on the mounting of the component itself, right? But again, there is a downside, right? So it's, you know the consequences of the local storage and all, right? So you would have seen this null pointer exception in terms of your JavaScript, like end of JSON input, and sometimes you change the structure of your local storage for one of your entity. For example, if you want to store a list of products and all, maybe it's not going to stay in the same contract. Right? You might keep on changing. So at that time, you have to refresh, you have to reset your local storage again and again. I'm pretty sure most of us would have faced this. So it's hard to debug. And then it's also less secure for the protective data, right? And eventually, it might be well suited for a small to medium applications and all. Like, again, it comes down to the requirements, because it's all the technical decisions that you're going to make before starting with the micro frontend, building of micro frontend itself. So the other option is event-based, right? In JavaScript, you have this event listeners, the custom event, right? You add an event listener or remove event listener. So this technique can also work for both build time and runtime integration, because we are talking about HTML, JavaScript, all those things, right? And it can also work better in terms of cross communication within the same page as events, right? Because let's take a micro frontend inside another micro frontend, right? So all it has to do is just subscribe. This one micro frontend has to publish, the other one has to subscribe. So this is more like the closest to the event-driven architecture in the microservices world, basically. The one thing to be cautious on this is you have to make sure to unsubscribe the event once the component is unmounted, right? So it's for the better performance as well. But again, the downside is you will eventually think about, you have a different team, handles different micro frontends, right? There is a huge possibility that each and every team will create more number of events. You will have a bloated number of events altogether. Of course, to solve that, maybe you can have a common library that handles all these events for you at a common place. Maybe you can have a message bus within that library. So all the micro frontends can use that, so that you don't have to change in each and every micro frontend, right? So it's about level of segregation all the time. So there are a couple of options over here. I'll try to share one of the ThoughtWorkers blog related to the communication. There are 1 or 2 options as well, which was tried it out, and it was pretty useful as well. I'll share it as part of the references. Right. So now that we have talked about communication, now comes the interesting part, right? So you are building an application that can be small or medium or even a large scale application as well, right? So in that case, we are talking about multiple front ends. It could be like more than 5, it could be more than 10 as well. We don't know that. But when you're actually deploying an application, irrespective of whether it's a B2B or a B2C or you have to authenticate, right? So you cannot, the security comes at first when you're actually, releasing it as a product, right? So how do you get the auth token for the authenticated micro front end itself? So there are a couple of options, right? So here, it also depends on the other factors that we decided, especially the composition, and how do you want to layer the authentication at one of the micro frontend or not, right? You can have a, let's take this example, right? So what if you have the container that renders all the style components for us, right? So maybe you can determine this container as a separate micro frontend who handles the authentication as well. Eventually, it can send the auth token for the rest of the micro frontend that is requiring the authentication itself. Or maybe you can segregate a micro frontend just for the authentication, like a user micro frontend, where you set the token on the browser storage and all. And eventually, you might not get the you might get the token on the other micro frontends as well. So there are a couple of options, right? You have to determine how do you actually give the responsibility of the authentication, especially the implementation for the authentication itself, so that other micro frontend can just utilize instead of reinventing or recreating the entire implementation altogether in all the micro frontends. So it's better to keep it at a single layer, maybe as a separate micro frontend, or maybe as part of the composition, you handle it as part of the container itself, which acts as a parent, right? Do we have any questions? Okay.
Mani, we have 15 minutes left. Just wanted to give you a quick time check.
Okay, let me just cover this. Maybe I'll just slightly fasten up. Yes, now we just talked about all the other factors, but how do you test it? Testing plays a huge role as part of the micro frontend itself, right? You have separate teams build separate micro frontend. Eventually, they will also test it independently, right? So the team 1, for example, build a micro frontend. They will obviously write some unit test or integration test or even UI test, right? And then they deploy it, and then they will also have this UI test running as part of the pipeline. But the problem comes as part of the entire application, right? So you're talking about after the stitching process, after it becomes a single application, like end-to-end functional test for the entire product. So that is when a lot of question arises: who owns them, along with the pipelines, who writes them, and when to write it, and also coordinating for all these tests, and also that you don't end up having duplication of tests, right, at a product level, at an single application level. So this is where there are a couple of options, practices, or there are methods or models that we come up across. You would have seen this testing pyramid, right? So you start with a lot of unit tests, and you go up with the pyramid so that you reduce a lot of manual tests, right? So you end up writing a lot of unit tests for your logics, and then some tests for the integration, some tests for UI test and all, so that you have simple tests, a lot of simple tests, so that you get fastest feedback first, and then slower layers later, right? So similarly, because I mean the UA tests are always costly, right? So you have to be very cautious on it. You have to wait for some time. It always, even at a pipeline level, you have to wait for the entire end-to-end test to be run, and then you cannot get the quick feedback point of view. So UA tests are always costly, but again, the confidence level is high, right? That is the end test that you're going to have it. So similarly, there is one other blog written by one of the thought worker, Corny. I'll also share this link, has come up with a slightly different model, right? The Swiss cheese model. So here in a cheese, you have this holes, right? Where you try to poke in a pin so that it doesn't come out of the cheese at the end of the layer. So the end of the layer is nothing but the gray area, which is, we are talking about the application. But the holes that we are talking about is the possibilities of bugs where it can traverse through multiple layers itself. So these layers, it's nothing but different tests, starting with units where you put all the logic, you test all the logics and eventually go forward onto the layer so that you write less UI tests. So basically order them in the order you want to run them, so that usually the simplest becomes the fastest feedback and then slower layers comes below them, right? So how do you measure that? It is not a very straightforward thing. It was well written in this blog. How do you actually layer these tests and all? I'll just add the link. You can go through in a broader way. But how do you measure it? It's always very complex. So it always suggests that work closely with the QA to determine the test cases according to the acceptance criteria itself. Because a QA will think in a very broad spectrum on how the test cases can be written, right? So of course, I mean, if the developer is going to write the end-to-end test, it's always better to work closely with the QA so that they will overview on your test itself. Or maybe before writing the test, you have a very quick catch up on what kind of test you want to write, because you don't want to repeat all the tests again and again, right? Let's take a quick example. So on one of the micro frontend, maybe team one's micro frontend, where you would have already written an UI test. Let's call it as this team one as a catalog, right? In terms of e-commerce, where you list down all the products. You would have written the UI test just asserts, gives confidence on how the listing has been done. But at the same time, there is another micro frontend, for example, cart, right? In an e-commerce. Would have tested just the cart section. But as an application, you don't get the confidence. That is where you are going to write an end-to-end functional test for the entire application. What if the cart has some bugs? You will eventually capture it at the end of the end-to-end test, right? You can clearly relate this with the Swiss cheese layers. Any questions? All right. I'll slightly fasten up over here. So now we have seen the options of it. How do you actually build a micro frontend? How do you, determine the different key aspects of micro frontend so that you can bring in the micro frontend architecture into your organization itself. So what do you get out of it? It's pretty evident, pretty straightforward as well, that you don't have, you have separate teams who builds both APIs and the UI together. So that means the teams are autonomous, right? Independent team building feature independently. So that means independent releases as well. So since it's multiple teams, the code base will be very smaller. So that means you have more control to your code, right? So if you want to upgrade a library or an NPM package, so in a single code base, you would have already faced this. You want to upgrade one of the NPM package, but it will eventually break another component. So you end up never updating that, and there will be a lot of security issues, performance issues. But in this case, you're talking about single code base where you have, you don't need to rely on other teams to upgrade for you and all. So teams have their own code base, can do such things freely, right? So there is no dependency over here itself. All right. Are there any best practices? I think now we can I think the question from Harshit can be answered in this way. There are a couple of best practices that we can follow, right? When you actually talk about micro frontend, I personally would suggest when you are actually determining in terms of slicing and composition, you also think about the common components, right? Or common behaviors on your application itself, so that you can start with the component library itself. Component library, I mean, in a simple layman terms, a single library for all, right? You just have a single component library being consumed by all the micro frontend itself, which means a component library will own the base components or maybe business components as well, which will be common across multiple micro frontends. And now, since you're talking about, having a common components, you might also have the theme for an entire application. Of course, there will be a design theme that will be consistent across your application, right? So you can also put your theme inside that so that there is just a single theme configuration utilized by all the micro frontend. So how do you do that? That is where the design kills comes into picture. It is not a pattern or it is not something very complex. It is just a regular check-in between the designers to have a common design system itself, right? So common style guide across front end to get utilized by the all the other micro frontends. For example, if you want, take a button, right, in an e-commerce website, you will have the button in across all the entire application itself. But if you want to extend it in a different interaction, different behavior, maybe as a micro frontend, you will have a tendency as a separate team, you have a tendency that you will eventually go and then change according to your teams, according to your application itself. But instead of doing that, this regular check-in will make sure that, okay, this behavior is actually being reused by other team members as well. Let me put it onto the component library and have a same behavior as well and test it only once. So there is no reinventing of any wheel, and also there is no duplication as well. Directly utilized by deciding onto getting into component library itself. Yeah. Harshit, I hope I answered your question. Just to reiterate, so component library is one such option, but the shared libraries comes down to behavior as well, right? So if you determine a subdomain where the component library, of course, right? Even in terms of component library, you can not just rely on a single component library. If you're talking about a product context, and let's take the product details page, right? Where you're going to just deal with the product. So in that case, maybe you can also think about having a component library for just certain micro frontend that just deals with the product context alone, right? The recommendation micro frontend, the product details alone. Maybe not for the other, like a home page, or maybe not for the checkout page, not for the transaction page, because they're never going to use such behavior. Maybe you can have a dedicated component library, an independent component library according to the context as well. So that's why I called it as best practices. It doesn't directly come into determining the key aspects of micro frontend. Instead, it just comes around as a best practices over here. Right? Any question?
No.
Cool. So quick, some inspirations, right? So who is actually using micro frontend? Micro frontends was there for already like 4 to 5 years. Some of the organization already have it in terms of the day-to-day practices. So one such example is the IKEA, where they use that edge side composition because they maybe preferred as a simple micro frontend architecture to begin with. Maybe they can also go to the client side or server side later. One. And if you look at the Spotify, who also uses micro frontends in terms of iframes, they also use for the communication between iframes, that is, using the event bus. Yes, now we have talked a lot about micro frontend. There are so many aspects that you have to determine, that you have to come across, you have to do a lot of things. So you will eventually have this question, to micro frontend or not, right? The answer is pretty straightforward. Micro frontend is always a marathon, not a sprint, right? That means you're not just going to build a micro frontend and immediately go and then have it ready as part of your production. It's never easy. If you're starting with a new application, yes, it's fine. But what about migrating from a legacy into a modern architecture, right? So that is when you're going to think incrementally. The only exercise you have to do is you have to think about all the key aspects that we decided. So the decision is a bit strong because you cannot go back and then change it again. You have to live with that, right? Or else you have to do a huge refactoring at every layer. Maybe at a best practices layer, yes, you can. The cost is a bit less, but not at the composition, not at the slicing point of it, because everyone is connected to that, right? So think about how the requirement is and think about all these options that suits your needs, and then slowly incorporate, like have a reverse proxy which renders the legacy code for you as part of one or the other micro frontend, or start with a built-in composition, slowly convert it into client side for better scalability. Or you maybe even like IKEA or some other people who all uses edge side composition. Start with that, eventually go for the any of the other runtime composition. Right? So with that, that's about the micro frontend options that I wanted to share. So these are all the references over here. There is a blog, wonderful blog on micro frontend by Martin Fowler. I'll try to share all these links in some way where there are examples as well, which you can straight away understand the micro frontend and then try to adopt it as part of your architecture. Yes, time for questions.
There are two questions, Mani. One is web components for CSI.
Yes, for sure. Again, right? There are a lot of options for the use cases that you have. Web components. I've never tried the web components over here, but it could be one of the option as well. But it comes down how you're going to structure your client-side composition, right? Basically, I hope it is the client side meant. It's what DVA meant. Or is it the ES side, edge side? Okay, I'll just share the knowledge on both the cases, because CSI is one of the other terms in terms of edge side composition. It's a tag. I think I've never tried it, but it's also part of edge side. Okay. In that case, you're talking about different micro frontends, right? We saw there is just a tag that's going to refer one of the micro frontends. So of course, you can use the web components as part of one of the other micro frontends. If it is client-side composition, if I'm not wrong, you have more control towards client-side composition, right? You're going to own as a simple front-end application itself. Like it can have Node.js, it can have any front-end frameworks as well. So web components, if it is a library, if I'm not wrong, you can easily incorporate and then use it, because it always comes down to how you bundle it at the end of the day before the stitching process, right? You can also have a dedicated pipeline to do the conversion for you. Right? All right. So the other question, if we are making shared components, can we adopt mono repository? Wow, good question, right? So the mono repo and micro frontends are two different things actually, right? Mono repo just handles how you're going to handle your repository and all. But micro frontend comes at an architecture level, right? So how do you actually structure your organization at first so that it is scalable at a team level? And then you are talking about the scaling up of applications, which again satisfied by the micro frontend itself, right? So these are all two different things actually. I think monorepo is altogether a different topic over here, but to answer it simply, right, from my experience, the shared components can act as a plug and play altogether. You can include that, or maybe you can also publish it as a internal library, right? If you are talking about the B2B applications, you can just have it as a separate or dedicated design system component library so that your mono repository or even your micro frontend can utilize. That's why it is shared, right? So you can determine how you want to give it to the consumers. Okay. Any other questions? Right. Cool. So if not, thanks everyone. I'm very surprised that I was on time. Anyway, I'll just this is my handle on LinkedIn. Feel free to follow me. I would be more than happy to share you the links and references that is required. There are a couple of, as I said, there are a couple of examples that has been put up onto the GitHub. where it actually exactly have the demo of how you can utilize the compositions, different compositions that we just described. It will be very straightforward to easily understand. It doesn't use any library. It will straightforward say how do you actually inject it onto your parent component, or how do you extract it as an application itself. So you can easily take, and then maybe you can also refer it, use it as a reference. It's just a public repository. I'll just share it.
Thank you so much for an interesting talk, Mani. I hope, there's a lot to take away, and we will also be sharing the reference links on the meetup group as well, so people can try it out, and also the recording of the event. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. We are right on time. We hope to see you folks next month. Again, the last Thursday of every month is when we have the event. For those of you who've not shared your feedback yet, please do take a moment to share your feedback before you drop off, which will help us work on getting better for the next sessions. Thank you so much.